Sherman with Graphical Networks. If you want to reach out to us, you can give us a call. Go to our website, graphicalnetworks.com, or shoot us an email, sales@graphicalnetworks.com, or Jason@graphicalnetworks.com, or Fred. Fred's the sales guy, so he's probably the one to talk to first. Fred.co, Fred, or Fred.co at graphicalnetworks.com. So either way. Oh boy, my Outlook is complaining. I don't know why, but anyway. So today we're going to talk about, I think, using data that you might have in your environment to visualize it, and maybe automate some documentation and that sort of thing. So why you do that just depends. You might have different reasons for doing that, of course. And of course, you might have different data sources. I think I have a polling question here I'm going to launch. Which tools do you currently use that house information about the network? You can select more than one. So these are just some examples. You might have other as well. So I'm going to launch the polling question, see if you guys can have any responses to that. Hopefully it works. Yeah, I mean, I don't know if you've seen our tool. Maybe you have, maybe you haven't. We are a network documentation tool primarily. I mean, we're a visualization tool of information and data, that sort of thing. So it's, you know, we could do sort of any and all those things. But one of the things we get asked a lot, I mean, or you probably know this with respect to documentation, network documentation, is trying to automate things. So taking either having something discover the network, or taking data that you have about your network and importing it, you know, bringing it in, those sorts of things. When I say data, bringing it in, I'm talking about, of course, data that's trusted source of data where you guys are updating it all the time. So that might be something like SolarWinds, where you're doing a network discovery of information. It might be Spectrum. It might be ServiceNow. Other Visio and spreadsheets are pretty high on the list here of what you guys responded to, so that's not unusual. Those are common everywhere. You know, they're ubiquitous. Everybody has spreadsheets. Everybody has, can't seem to stop that Outlook thing from popping up. Let me try closing that window. And so on. So, which is great. And we try and accommodate those different systems in different ways, from Visio import, of being able to convert a Visio document from objects into nodes. It's not always ideal. It depends on what you're trying to do. If it's just logical drawings, it's usually great. If you're trying to switch to like physical, where you try to do hierarchies of devices and things like that, not always ideal, because the objects don't come across as devices in our tool. We have a concept of nodes and devices. So we have actually different object types. So it's not just like a stencil. It's a object that we call modeled, which got ports and slots and all these other things. So anyway, you know, that's just a limitation really on from the Visio side and how they work. You know, we can only do so much with that data. Spreadsheets, we do certainly spreadsheet import, CSV. It's pretty good. I can build an entire project with spreadsheet import. Of course, there's formats, functionality, and other things you gotta put into our format. There's a certain thing you follow process-wise, and then you can import it and you can build a project from that. So that's good. So sometimes you can take data you have and convert it over, and sometimes you can't, or you have to, you know, maybe move the data around a little bit or do something. It just depends. But I do a lot of projects with Excel import. As far as not just beginning projects, but sometimes people want to use Excel as a means of updating the projects, because what they'll do is they'll have a format of their own. They follow a certain standard, and you know, where they and how they collect data and so on. They'll give that to the folks in the field or engineers or whoever. They'll populate that, and then that just gets sent back or automatically uploaded, or they'll upload it. So it just depends on the process and who you are. SolarWinds, Spectrum, other systems, and so on. So I'm going to talk about some of those other tools. But the clear winner was spreadsheets, by the way, for everybody responding. So with respect to our tool, I have to pause this for a second. I'm sorry, give me a sec. This This Outlook thing is driving me bonkers. I don't know why it keeps popping up. I actually closed Outlook, but much like a lot of systems on your computer, even if you shut them down, they're not really shut down. They're sitting there running. So I'm going to enter my password into the system and click OK, and hopefully that resolves its little problem. And now I'm going to close my Outlook, and hopefully it goes away for a while. I don't know. Anyway, let me resume the share. Sorry about that. So when you have different systems out there, you know, collecting data, in the past, what we would do is, I mean, for Visio or something like Visio Import, we use Visio software as basically the conversion mechanism because they have their own APIs. Unfortunately, Visio, their APIs are a little, they don't seem to update that stuff anymore. It's been a long time, and it's a little more limited in functionality what you can do. But we do a pretty good job of actually bringing those things across, I have to say, for the most part. But not always ideal. What's really ideal today is using systems APIs, so using calls that are purpose-built for pulling data from systems. You know, any system that's going to integrate with another system, typically they're using some sort of API, REST or SOAP that we found. So we have we have our own robust REST API, but in addition to that, we call on other systems to use their APIs. As an example, I'm going to bring up my, it's called the collector here. I'll just I have a few pieces of data in here. So we have, I don't have all of these in here, but just a few. And some of them correspond to what you guys were talking about, but things like ServiceNow and SolarWinds, Spectrum, vCenter, Velocity, and so on. These we have a pre-built, what we call connector to those data sources. So they will pull in information from those systems depending on the connector and what's been requested. You know, we pull a certain set of data. That doesn't mean that it's limited to that either, because sometimes we may do a connector and we may just pull devices from it, or we may pull something very specific from that tool. Oftentimes that's based on customer request. And so we'll build that kind of specific to what they were pulling data for, but then someone might come along and go, oh, well, SolarWinds, I also wanted to pull this out of there. Can you do that? Because it's using APIs, it's usually very easy to add functionality to these connectors to pull different data from the APIs. In fact, if I go over to the right-hand side, the interface is something like this, where you're putting in a user and password and a REST endpoint, and that's it. In the past, years ago, we would connect using a database. We'd connect to a database table of data, and then we'd pull it that way. And that had its own limitations because you had to have a piece of software, what we call our integration toolkit, basically right next to the database to connect to it. So it was cumbersome. They had permissions, and it had to be on a system that was really near or next to that database, or, you know, certainly close to it in some way. But here, all you're doing with APIs is you're just making a call to a URL. So all you really need is a secure layer as far as secure connection to that data source. So SolarWinds, ServiceNow, like some of the ones I mentioned here. Forget SNMP though for a second, because that's not an API call, that's a discovery. But the point is, if you have data in a system, whether it's listed here or not, it doesn't really matter, because if it's a pretty modern system and they have APIs, we can usually build connectors for it. And sometimes we'll do that as part of a project, so there's really no cost for it. Other times there might be a charge, it just depends. So you have to kind of check with us and let us know what you have and what you're looking to do. And we talk to you about it, and then look at the APIs that are available and see how easy or hard it might be to develop for that connector. Usually they're not hard though. Most companies have pretty good documentation on their APIs, so you can do a connection. So just some examples of like data, perhaps. So something like, let's say SolarWinds, like I have a bunch of objects. These are devices that are discovered from SolarWinds. And I'll show you what this looks like after you push it into our tool and what you can do with the data from there. So something like SolarWinds, AWS, AWS like security groups and elastic IPs and that sort of thing you can get. So if you're doing more and more cloud computing, AWS we have a really strong connector for. Azure we've got a connector for, so you can get some of the resources from there as well. it's not as, I don't have as many sort of pre-built connections in Azure as I do in AWS, where the relationships are sort of all pre-defined. I'll show you what I mean by that in a second. But again, Azure, AWS, Google, they have really strong APIs because they want you to do everything, through automation and command lines and API stuff. So it's great. SNMP I'll talk about in a second. If you're using a tool like we have an EM, we have our EM tool, which allows you to go out and do IPMI and do discovery on some devices, but more importantly, get real-time power and data monitoring data. We'll pull data back for that and push that into netTerrain so we get constant updates on something like power reads or temperature reads, depending on the device type. And something like ServiceNow, where you're going in, you're seeing hardware, right? So this is a big set of hardware from ServiceNow. This is from their development platform. So we use kind of their pre-built data. So it's not terribly exciting data, but it just gives you an idea of some of the things you can get out of the ServiceNow platform. That's just a small example because they also have huge sets of data you can collect from. So the point of all of this is kind of twofold. One is, of course, leveraging data that you have in your environment that you're already using. I mean, if you're ServiceNow or SolarWinds or whatever it happens to be, and you want to leverage that information because there already is a process of discovery or data entry or whatever it happens to be into those systems, then take advantage of that data and take it and bring it and push it into like our tool, if that's your choice, of course. So we're in our software, netTerrain. If you haven't seen it, I mean, it's built for doing network, really documentation, right? So you take this. Now the other side of this is SNMP, where you're doing a discovery, where you have the system go out and discover data and information and push that data into netTerrain as well. So I'll show you. Well, I think the best thing to do is switch gears a little bit. So hopefully that makes sense. I mean, you're setting up connections to data. You're taking the data and you're pushing it into our netTerrain server. And so you can do that on a regular basis or manually. So there's a button here you press to do a scan. Scan means go out and get data from these systems, and that data gets collected and pulled into this tool, which is what's called the netTerrain collector. And the netTerrain collector basically runs on a machine. It could be your local Windows desktop, or it could be on a server. It doesn't really matter where it runs, as long as it has connectivity back to whatever it needs to connect to. So for instance, I'm going to use this drawing tool for a second. So you got the collector, right? And then you got your netTerrain server. I'm a great artist here. And then you have, of course, your system, right? So let's say it's ServiceNow. Okay. So clearly you have these connections that happen. The collector just needs access to ServiceNow using a URL and a user and password, and then it pulls the data in, and then that data gets passed into the netTerrain system. But where this lives doesn't matter, as long as it has a URL and it can connect to ServiceNow and it connect to the netTerrain system via a URL and using our APIs, because that's what we do. We have our own APIs that we use, and when we push data, we use those APIs to push data. So it's all basically browser URLs that you're pulling data and then you're pushing data. And if you want to push data, you can do it manually. You can also set this thing up, this tool, this collector tool, to run as a service on a server, or I could just install it on my desktop or laptop and periodically do a scan and then a push. You could go out in the field. So if you were going on site to where you had just bought a new company and you need to do an inventory, or you need to do some sort of discovery, you might use our SNMP discovery to go out and discover what's on that network and then bring data. Or you'll use your SolarWinds, or they have data already, and so on, right? So just depends on what you want to do. With discovery, in our tool, you basically go in and put in your credentials and push. In the next version, we also have seed discovery, so you can go in and check mark the seed and so on. So what happens with its data? You collect data, or it's collecting data on a regular basis, and then you push data into some other system, right? So in that case, you might push it into you're pushing into netTerrain, not might, that's where you'd put it. So the data itself, you go in and you look at it and you say, okay, well, what am I getting? Well, if it's something like SolarWinds, it would be things like the actual devices, might be even connections and things like that. So SolarWinds. So here I'm getting the actual device. I'm telling the system this is the device based on the system object ID, and display that information in that data. If you're doing something like SNMP, that would be like R discovery, basically, same kind of thing. It's discovering the devices, and it's bringing those devices into the collection point of netTerrain. And then from there, you can take these devices and move them, and I'll talk about that in a second. Something like ServiceNow, where you got a lot of hardware coming in. This is more, these aren't true devices, so they're more displayed as just objects. So just objects with data fields and stuff like, ThinkPads and MacBooks. I mean, I could change these to be more specific to a device type, or an object type, I should say. But you start picking up all this data, and then what do you do with that data, right? Well, I mean, there's a couple of things you can do. One, in the case of something like SolarWinds, maybe don't do anything. You just organize it from the standpoint of, I'm just going to lay these out in my drawing, make the drawing look nice, and then as things get added, you'll see new connections and other things. So it's a logical drawing that's basically automatically generated from the data that's in this case inside SolarWinds, right? So there's your automation as far as visualizing the data that's in a system. You're doing it. You're collecting it with the collector. You're pushing it in netTerrain. The only thing you might have to do is organize the data. You might have to move things around a little bit on the screen. You might put this here, and you might move this over here, and do stuff like that. And that's pretty straightforward. You might also put everything in one drawing. Like, these are separate kind of data centers from that standpoint. If you were doing like R discovery, same kind of thing. We actually collect all the data into the IP address ranges. I just brought them all back into one drawing, just so it's more logical. Now, after you bring data in, whether it's ServiceNow or whether it's a tool like the SNMP Discovery or whatever it happens to be, you can take these devices and put them into a physical infrastructure, right? So, like, for instance, this device doesn't just live in this sort of logical drawing of, how is the network connected, but it also lives in its what I call aliased into the physical hierarchy of, where does this thing live? So for instance, this particular device lives in this cabinet. This cabinet's the A4 cabinet of the 3rd floor of this building, of this location, University of Maryland. So I'm taking discovered information and data, and I'm placing this information into the physical. But I can also leave it in the discovered area or in a logical drawing, or I can put it in multiple drawings by aliasing. That's getting into the weeds. But my point is, this is where you get into leveraging data and helping you sort of visualize the information that you have out there. Because, with respect to network documentation, it's sort of the last thing you ever want to do, and with respect to your organization usually, but it's usually pretty critical, especially when you have to do troubleshooting, even things like inventory, capacity planning, management, certainly cable management, and those types of things. You start to get into, and it's important to understand and know how to understand those relationships. So the long and the short is, if you have data in the system, maybe it's not in a current collector that we have right now, certainly talk to us about it. It might be something we're already planning on anyway, connector-wise, or maybe it's something that we can just build for you. That just depends. Again, we'd have to have a conversation and see. But you can leverage information and data that you have, and it doesn't have to be a hard process to follow either. Bring the data in, some settings, maybe some, what we call mapping of types from our catalog to the objects in netTerrain, and kind of go from there, and really start to set things up where it's just automatic, where if there's a new device discovered by SolarWinds, or in the SNMP Discovery or one of the other tools that were mentioned, it just shows up inside netTerrain, and either you move it or it automatically gets moved. That kind of just depends on the connector and stuff. But anyway, that's about all I wanted to talk about and discuss. Well, I'm gonna see if there's any questions. Let me see if there's any other polling questions too. Sorry, sometimes I forget about these other polls. I think that was it. I think we just had one. Yep. So I guess we just had one polling question today. So if there's any questions, you can like raise your hand, I think. There's a chat here. Oh, here we go. Is best practice to use an alias in the physical layout or in the logical diagram? That's a great question. So the nice thing about doing it from logical alias, from logical to physical, is it's easy, right? Because if you're already discovering it in a logical drawing, like if you're doing a discovery like I did with like SNMP or ServiceNow or SolarWinds, then it's easy for me to just grab a device it found and put it in the physical because I know where it goes, right? So I alias it over, which is fine. But from the standpoint of getting to the device, I have to right click and do the find alias and then go find it. I mean, I could do a search by looking for the DNS name too. So I guess I could do it that way, but it's kind of more user preference. I have a tendency to alias what's in the physical. So that way, what we refer to as the master object is always in the cabinet, and then the aliases are always like in the logical drawings. But I guess ultimately what it really comes down to is where the data is coming from. If it's part of a discovery and I don't want to break up, you know, what I've done in my logical discovery, and I want to keep that sort of intact, then I'm probably going to alias things from there. So it's a good question. So the answer is depends. So let me see if there's any questions. I don't see any right now. I'll give you guys a minute to gather your thoughts and see if you have any questions. But if you want to try things out, you can certainly go to, if you're not a current customer or so on, you can go to netTerrain.com and sign up. And inside there, there's a utilities button within the toolbar. In fact, I can show it to you, I guess. If I go over to my workspace here and I go to help, utilities, there's a collector in here. You're only going to see that if this is at least version 8.6. You're not going to see the collector otherwise. So if you go, you can download collector. But if you go to netterrain.com, you can sign up. That'll be version 8.6. And you can try the collector out and get an idea how that kind of works. And if you have questions, you get stuck and I try to do something, give us a call. We're pretty, we're not too scary, I don't think, you know, as far as talking to, but maybe the sales guy is, I don't know. No, Fred's a pretty good guy. So yeah, if any questions or comments come up, just let us know. But other than that, I think that was it. So thanks everybody for attending. I'm sure there'll be a link if you want to watch this again at some point. But again, if you want to try it out, netterrain.com, or if you have other questions, pricing and all that good stuff, netterrain.com has some pricing on it for sort of smaller quantities, size-wise. I mean, that's cloud, but on-prem is similar. You, again, talk to one of the sales guys about that. And what else I was going to say? Yeah, call or email, write, whatever. If you got questions, let us know. So thanks, everybody, for your time. Really appreciate it.